you go down and then you go up to make it better, make it better. Down on the ground, it's just one way up. Make it better, make it better. If you stand by me, I will stand by you. To make it better, make it better.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Rise Up with Rebecca Seawright on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Assemblymember Rebecca Seawright, serving the Upper East Side, Yorkville, and Roosevelt Island. And we're hosting tonight from our East 79th Street community office. Tonight we will be talking about relief for Ukraine with special guest Andrei Dobranansky. He is the Director of Communications and Media for Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. But before we begin our discussion and your special understanding of this horrific situation in the Ukrainian homeland, tell us a little bit, Andrei, about your background.
Born and raised New Yorker, so thank you for having me on. My father came over here after the end of World War II. He finished his high school age in a German displaced persons camp. And then on my mother's side, her father came over as well as her grandfather. So I have 3 generations of immigration. It's always been very important for me to be involved in the community that way. Thankfully, right from the very beginning, I was in a bilingual household. In fact, most of my speaking was with the Ukrainian language before I went to an American school. But I had a lot of great opportunities because of my immigrant community. I got to, perform at Carnegie Hall, Broadway, Lincoln Center, all because I was part of different Ukrainian performing troupes. And almost immediately, as soon as I became an adult, I started to teach in that community as well. So what I did after that is Ukraine got invaded. And my wonderful old ladies in the choir said, Andrei, you've been doing this on stage much longer than we have. Why don't you talk to the press for us? And that's where I am now as a community organizer.
Terrific, terrific. And it was your father who was a highly accomplished baritone and performed for many years here in New York with the Metropolitan Opera, I understand. So please describe from your personal knowledge of the situation on the ground, what are you hearing from friends and family?
Well, the people I speak to mostly are actually people who who grew up with me in New York, people I used to do folk dancing with in the East Village, who moved over to Ukraine, people who've married with Ukrainians, have children there now. And they're the people who I treat the most closely. Again, my father having survived the horrors of the bombing of 1939, most of his family was killed off. I do have second cousins on my mother's side, but in Ukraine still. But in terms of the people I speak to mostly, it's people who grew up in America and share, those common ideals of, self-determination, freedom, entrepreneurship. They go to Ukraine, they say, we can do something here. So those are the people I speak with most, and they've had to make difficult decisions. Some of those with American passports wonder if the best thing to do is for them to come to America. Many of them who are those spouses who were born in Ukraine feel the same way any New Yorker would feel if a tank rolled up 7th Avenue and said, this is our neighborhood now. So a lot of them are determined to stay. And in fact, our national president was just in Poland on the Kodel with Senator A.B. Klobuchar, our friend Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut, and some others. And the people that they saw coming over from Poland, they were saying, we would love to go back. So the people coming into Poland, because there was an airstrike right on the Ukrainian border with Poland a couple of hours earlier. And that's the only reason they started leaving, is because it came closer and closer to where they live. However, they asked the world to do whatever they can to protect them from those bombs that happen in the middle of the night. Otherwise, they said they would absolutely love to stay. So there's a conflict there of what to do. Do you go somewhere safer, or do you stay and fight?
Right. Wow. So from the news reports that we've learned of the extreme courage and that's been demonstrated by Ukrainian people, they've helped win the war for public opinion. Can you talk about the spirit of these people?
Yeah, it's determination. It's a lot of things. I would like to talk about how brave our people are, and sure, the bravery is unparalleled in my mind, but I also want to reflect on just how traumatized some of these people are. For instance, before this recent bombing campaign, this new invasion, Ukraine had been at war since 2014, since the invasion of Crimea and Donbass. That meant 1.5 million people were displaced internally within Ukraine. And the vast majority of those people were women, 65%. And as people, I'm a representative for my diaspora at the United Nations. And for people who deal with displaced populations, especially women who are displaced, you understand, you get to learn the fact that once people are displaced once, moving yet again is even more re-traumatizing, because it takes so long to reestablish yourself in a community, find a home, feel comfortable enough, and also not feel like an outsider enough to get a job in that community. So we are actually hearing from people on the ground in Ukraine that many people don't want to leave where they currently are in Ukraine because they've already been displaced and they just can't imagine being displaced yet again. So that's part of the reason that people are staying, as well as a lot of elderly people who may have survived World War II and say, I've been through the end of the world. What do I need to leave? This is my apartment. This is all I need. In fact, it really resonates with some of my community here in New York City. During the pandemic, obviously, we had to close our churches, especially at that very beginning. And frankly, that same community, those people who survived World War II that I speak to on a regular basis, they were trying to get into the churches so much. And they said, Andriy, I survived the end of the world. I just want to be close to God at this point in my life. So similarly, when you have comfort, when you know your home, and that may be in Kyiv, that may be in Poltava, that may be in any city in Ukraine, and all of a sudden the civilian buildings around you start exploding, some people are making the decision that they're going to stay because that's just where they're going to be.
Right. Wow. I know some of the neighboring countries have been so helpful to the refugees fleeing to safety. What's been the ongoing response from these other countries?
Right. So we're at over 3 million right now, according to the United Nations, of how many people have come into those 4 neighboring countries. And that's Poland with the most. Poland at over 1.5 million, half of which are children. Hungary is just at around 300,000. And then you have Moldova with smaller amounts, and Slovakia, and both of those countries have much smaller borders with Ukraine that are accessible. Those countries are, some people may be familiar with the news about how different refugees had been trying to gain access for years. So there are already existing laws on the books about how long refugees can be there. For instance, in Poland, even our Ukrainian Polish organizations, which have been there for centuries, they are only allowed to house people in their halls or their convention centers only for 48 hours. After 48 hours, in a cot in a room, you need to move on to someplace else because of the laws that were in place from the refugee crisis from only a few years ago. So that's why we're also looking to European countries to make sure that they accept as many of those people as possible as well. Because, for instance, Poland, that's over 1.5 million people in Poland. That's more than a big city. Some of the biggest regional capitals of Ukraine are only 300,000 or 400,000 people. So 1.5 million people just showing up, that's a lot of resources that you need physically. Where are you going to house them? Where are you going to feed them? So so that's a reason for the rest of Europe to do something about this. I know that our local leaders here, and I'm grateful for Congresswoman Maloney for saying that we needed TPS status for the people who are here already. But at some point, we may need some kind of transitory, temporary a parole for people to come here, at least temporarily. And again, I do have to emphasize that almost everybody that comes across the border aren't looking for an opportunity somewhere else. They would love to return back as soon as it's possible for them to return.
Right, right. And very naturally just want to get back to their homeland. So what are the efforts here in New York City to relocate displaced persons to safety here in New York?
Thank you for asking. That's actually one of my pet projects. Because we realized almost immediately that there will be a crisis here already in the country, because people were anticipating it may take months for refugees to come over. But in fact, people travel from Ukraine to the United States on a regular basis. There are a lot of people here on student visas, people here who work on work visas for any number of reasons, as well as people who already have either 6-month, even 10-year visas to enter and visit the United States. I know specifically many grandparents have those kind of long-term visas. They're older, they're not going to relocate, so the government is fine with them having those. But we have determined that the best way to find out how many people are here is going through the Border Control Service. And they are able to tell us that there are roughly, and again, you never know who's undocumented, but there are roughly 34,000 Ukrainian nationals with no set immigration status here, which means they are here on visas or they have overstayed a visa, but they are here in this country. We don't have an exact approximation of where these people are. We have surveys that tell us they're in major population centers. They include states like New York, states like California, Pacific Northwest, and even North Carolina. But what we need to do is we need to support Ukraine's consular service in this country because they are completely overwhelmed. So Ukrainian organizations who have been in existence since that time that my father came over after World War II are springing into action to determine the best way to help some of these people. Now, for some of those people, we have been overwhelmed with the generosity of people saying, I have an Airbnb account, just tell me how many days they need. We also have had people, from far away from Long Island or upstate New York, or even I had a farm in North New Hampshire reach out to us and say, we have space for refugees when the time comes. But the issue is that we want people here to do things in a manner that both the Ukrainian consular services can have a record of them because they're still Ukrainian citizens. So we need to be able to, for the Ukrainian government to have services for them as needed. But also, we need to vet some of these people in a way that everybody will feel comfortable letting them into the country, etc. So we want people registered for TPS status as soon as possible. The Secretary Mayorkas from DHS announced that people here in this country from March 1st can register for TPS status, which then can get them employment opportunities as well, but at the very least in the system, so they will not be deported for 18 months. We do know that there's a DED as well, so anybody who's in this country will not be deported for the time being. And we also know that the State Department has labeled Ukrainian nationals as homeless nationalities, which means we don't expect that these people to be sent back to their country of origin to apply for a refugee status or something, because A, it's not safe for them in that country due to the war, and B, the United States is not offering consular services for them. So those are reasons why Ukrainians are remaining, those 30,000 in this country. And we do want to see what we can do about, again, getting some of those millions of people who are currently bottlenecking in those countries that do not have the resources to take care of them in Eastern Europe. But what we're hoping to do is set up some kind of temporary housing for some of those 30,000 sooner rather than later. Like many immigrant communities in New York, we do have some campgrounds, mini bungalows up in the Catskills that I spent many a night as a young dance camp instructor that we're hoping to use as temporary housing at some point. We're also looking to possibly using universities in the tri-state area that could house people over the summer temporarily until we get to the point that either they're safe enough to go back to Ukraine, or we would need to look for something that's in the year range of housing. And that would hopefully be in an area that already has existing Ukrainian American community, that the children can speak in Ukrainian with Ukrainian American children, Ukrainian American financial institutions, businesses and schools, to make that transition a little easier up until they can return back to Ukraine.
Well, I just want to commend you so much for what you are doing and helping, and for our viewers out there that want to get involved and help. Where would you, I know we're going to be doing a supply efforts here out of our local community office on York and 79th Street, but many of our constituents have been asking how they can help and how they can get involved other than dropping off supplies or sending cash. And many of us take the crosstown bus along East 79th Street, and we see the Ukrainian Institute at the corner of 5th Avenue and 79th Street. It's a wonderful, familiar sight, and I understand the Institute promotes through educational, professional, and social activities a greater awareness, knowledge, and appreciation of Ukraine and the Ukrainians' rich culture, history, and accomplishments. And so what are some ideas on how people can get involved and help?
Well, first and foremost, we are focusing on cash because cash can help in Europe sooner than a plane of supplies or even longer, these container ships that are going to bring taking clothes and diapers that are being dropped off at our location. So we emphasize with the great Ambassador Samantha Power, who now is in charge of the administrator of USAID, doing a wonderful job, not only at that, but also of communicating with the Ukrainian American community. And their social media message is cash is best. And so if people do want to donate, the USAID website has verified sites. Also on our website, the ucca.org, we have not only our campaign that goes directly to Europe, but you can find a number of Ukrainian American organizations. That includes the Ukrainian American veterans who do local work. That includes Ukrainian American churches, Ukrainian American doctors associations, bar associations. So there's different ways to donate if people want to work with a local organization and go that way. As far as people volunteering to help, that goes back to the question that you just asked about what to do with people who are here temporarily and might need some help. We will definitely be soliciting the help of the wonderful generosity of our neighbors, our New Yorkers and Americans here in terms of helping people who might need maybe some processing, some help going through forms. We all know that it's rather difficult to get through a website of entering your information, especially if you're traumatized from having to leave your home so suddenly. And some people may be stuck here with just a bag and their passport. So we might need to figure out other means of helping them out, whether that's entertaining them in some way, whether that's finding some way of getting them more clothes. Things will be worked out, and we have a wonderful set of volunteers already, but I would just keep updating yourself on our website, ucca.org, and all of our associated organizations are listed there that people can find something locally.
Terrific. And I was just going to ask you, what are the best social media feeds and websites for those, yes, for changing needs constantly of ways to help?
Yeah, well, again, that's the issue. Things are changing so constantly that even from last week to this week, the needs that were reported in Poland are different. Last week, many of the Polish volunteers were saying that we don't need any more help. We've got this under control. People who don't speak the language will just be in the way. And well, come 5 days later, they need a little bit more help. So we don't have a program set up yet, but we do know the other NGOs that are looking for help, people who want to go to Europe and maybe help people apply for a refugee status, apply for asylum status, or at least find housing in some way. And in terms of trying to do best, I would first and foremost go back to USAID, which is a big point person, and USAID.gov has a landing page for what's happening in Ukraine, how to give, what resources are needed. And they also have an updated weekly status report that matches numbers with the United Nations. So you could actually see how many people have come into each country.
Thank you. And if you could just repeat that website one more time for our viewers.
Sure. So again, the best government website is usaid.gov. USAID, their website, and that has a landing page specifically for Ukraine. If you want to find out Ukrainian American organizations, you can always go to the community page of ucca.org. And
where is the largest Ukrainian population in New York?
Mostly in the metro area, but we have communities going all the way up to Buffalo. Know our governor very well. Rochester, Syracuse, Binghamton, Yonkers has a big community. And then the New York City metro area is the biggest, the bulk of that being more recent immigrants who populate Brooklyn. But we have Ukrainian organizations in each borough. They're very active. They would just like to get back to the days of folk dancing and making Easter eggs. But at this moment, we are retooling ourselves to help our people who are struggling in the homeland.
Well, we thank you for all that you're doing, and our hearts and prayers or thoughts with your people. And we'll be doing our own donation drive here out of our community office. And we just appreciate so much your sharing your information, your culture, your heritage, and what we can do for all the refugees and for that country. So, Andre, I wanted to ask you, what's going on the ground with the refugees? I know women and children comprise, and people under the age of 18 comprise the most refugees that are going into Poland and neighboring countries. Are they using strollers for the infants and for the children, for beds? What is going on?
Yeah, the bulk of people who are moving further away from the conflict, and unfortunately the conflict is spraying into all of Ukraine, are mostly going to be mothers and children, less so than just women and children. A full quarter of the Ukrainian military is women, and over 1,000 of those are senior military officers. So it's I like to make sure that people understand when we say women and children are going across the border, it doesn't mean that all women, because a fair amount are in this fight and they want to be in the fight. As far as the people who are crossing the border or just moving from one town to another, one town that's bombed and into another, we have numerous stories of people who go to another town and don't go further on. They want to keep going and helping out in some way. So they'll come into a town and they'll start ripping out bandages, making sure there's enough bandages for the war effort. They'll pack supplies, whether that's food, to have a carrier bring it back to the front line. So it's not necessarily that people are all traveling out. However, if your community, your township is bombed specifically, that's when you'll see people move. And unfortunately, a lot of the areas that are being bombed are civilian areas. We all saw the horrible images of that maternity ward in the east of Ukraine that was bombed. There was a children's cancer ward that was also hit under attack. And most recently, there was the Mariupol drama theater, which was housing so many children. And the shocking thing was that they even wrote the word children in Russian letters on the ground in the plaza in behind and back, so that if a bomber was above, they could see that they're saying there's children in this building, please don't bomb it. And yet it was still bombed. What we're also looking at is the fact that the things that are being bombed are not only these maternity hospitals, but any kind of hospitals. So hospitals, and what we're hearing now are food supplies as well, to really affect the population. Why that matters in terms of hospitals, one of them is specifically for women's health. The UN Population Fund estimates that in the next 3 months, 80,000 women are scheduled to give birth in Ukraine. That's, in 2 months, we're at Mother's Day, and in 3 months, we'll have 80,000. Now, some of those cute pictures we've seen of that child being born in the subway in a bomb shelter, those are great visuals, but I can't actually imagine what it would be like if you have no access to a hospital. And these aren't pre-planned home births. These will be emergency births that need to be given in a car, in somebody's emergency shelter. And that's why the Ukrainian people, when they come over to Poland, they're asking for protection of who's left behind in Ukraine. And they're saying these words: close the sky. You may have heard no-fly zone or other things, but I can tell you personally, they're coming over the border and they say, just close the sky. They don't know what that means or how you do it. But if you can stop those bombs that are coming, and many of them don't even come from Ukrainian territory, they're long-range missiles from Russia or ships they have in the Black Sea where they shoot, and they're firing them at these civilian areas. And they're just saying, we could deal with the war and how that's going. But these bombs that happen in the middle of the night in civilian areas is what we're really worried about. So I do like to focus on the fact to bring people's attention when we have our big experts on TV or, in Congress. Usually there are men involved, and usually they talk about the mutual destruction or how bad war can be. And I like to redirect it back to what these people actually on the ground are dealing with. And that's trying to find out where their next meal is going to be, and trying to find out when in the next 2 or 3 months, when they're due to give birth, how that's going to happen, where that's going to happen. Maybe that happens in a refugee camp, but maybe that's going to happen just on the side of the road. And that's why people are asking Washington or the other European capitals to do something more. It's not on the refugee side. Their job isn't to be a military advisor, but they asked the rest of the world to do more. And that's why we're grateful that President Biden made an announcement this week that he's going to do something more. Congress passed a huge bit of legislation. All of this is in response to understanding that something needs to be done, and that something will be done. So that's what we can thank the rest of the world for doing. They're realizing there's a problem, and they are moving more and more in terms of doing something more. So that's the great thing I can report on.
And do you remain hopeful that there'll be anything positive coming out of this war.
Well, the national anthem of Ukraine begins, "Ukraine has not yet perished." So we are a people that have lived as a historically oppressed peoples, whether that's, centuries back, whether that's under one wave of repression by the Tsars, the Soviet Union, and the genocide. Our homeland in Ukraine actually recognizes 3 genocides within 15 years at the beginning of the 20th century. That's how, not pleasant things have been in our history. And still, even after all of that, we were able to have the Soviet Union end, not with a lot of bloodshed, but with people just finally saying that enough is enough. And we're hoping that at some point enough is enough, and that the people of Ukraine can be allowed to return back to their homes, rebuild. There's already a lot of generosity by the European neighbors who said, "I'll rebuild this important building," or "I'll rebuild the hospital for you." And that's so generous, to even during this middle of the war saying, "We're going to do something for you." So so that generosity is really welcome. But I think what you'll see is exactly what we talk about in our national anthem. Ukraine has not yet perished. Ukrainians will lay down body and soul, as we saw on the cold streets of Kyiv in the middle of the Revolution of Dignity. There's a determination about making sure that you can chart your own course in history. It's a very American ideal. It's a very Ukrainian ideal, and we have that hope. I think that's something that bonds us with our American brothers and sisters as well. Hope that there's a better future out there, and that we will see it one day.
Well, please know that our prayers and thoughts are with you and with your people. And I want to again thank our special guest, Andrei Drobiansky, for joining us this evening, and for all that you and your organizations are doing out there to help, and for being the representative that you are to your community. And thank you to our viewers for watching this evening Rise Up with Rebecca Seawright on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network.
First you go down and then you go